Hello, Culminators. Today, I'm gonna press my guest. He's not ready for this. I'm gonna ask him some. No, he's giggling. He's laughing. Of course, I'm speaking about Chase Geiser. You know that because it says so right below whatever you're looking at or listening. If you're listening in the car, please keep your eyes on the road. But if otherwise, we're gonna get to the bottom of this Chase Geiser phenomenon because I just don't buy his explanation. I got a little bit out of him when I appeared on his show. And I'm going to show you in a second exactly what I'm talking about. But first, let me welcome Chase officially, and we'll throw him up on the screen there. I'm sure of course, everything's always on the screen. That's the way we do it. How are you today, this morning, this fine day? You're still in Austin, right?
Yes, sir. I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. I am in warm and sunny Austin, Texas.
Yeah, well, it's pretty warm and sunny here in Newark as well. Here's what I'm getting at, Chase. I'm gonna just kind of try. I don't think I really can. I'm gonna kind of try to sandbag you a little bit. This was my appearance on Chase's podcast, and it's a very important one for me. It's usual droning, but first of all, one important thing about this appearance was that look how awful I look, and look how good Chase looks. Okay, well, right, fine. So he's better looking and he's younger, but besides that, that made me buy a new camera. Because I said, the difference in quality there was just, depressing. Now, I actually think today you're not using that same camera.
No, that one had some overheating problems. So I have a different technology, but it's actually a more expensive camera. I'm not sure if it looks good.
Well, we'll see when we see the real thing. But I think this time I'll be able to match you, at least in terms of video quality. During our discussion, like many people listening to this were wondering what I was wondering about and asked you. And I'm still kind of wondering about it. What am I talking about? I'm talking about this. Who's Chase Geiser? Who is Chase Geiser? So look, he's one American. Great. We're all one American. Some of us are arguably large enough to, constitute more than one American, but that's not how it goes. This is confirmation that Chase and I are speaking today. So here you look. Okay, so the guy has a podcast. Fine. I mean, he also wrote a book, which is coming out in a year. So in other words, he hasn't written anything. I could claim I'm going to write a book in January 2023 also. Oh, so let's just click through here. One American podcast. Okay, so website. Let's go to the website.
I hope all these links are working.
No, I actually ran through it. Plus, we're recording anyway. This is actually a lot like the moon landing, completely pre-canned and never actually. This podcast never happened. And here are the guests that are featured. I understand. I'm not a featured guy. I'm not like these superstars on here, so that's fine. I'm not that. But I'm here for information, not about myself. I know everything about myself. So let's figure out what Chase is about. Chase is the host of One American Podcast. I feel like I'm in a little bit of a loop here. Chase lives, works, and podcasts in Austin, and of course he's looking for more of the same. And of course, any one of these links, they're just going to lead me back here and tell me that he has a podcast. Great, everyone has a podcast. Okay, now, all right. So Chase has been on Twitter since April 2009, which is 4 months after I came on, and he must have been 10 years old. But come on, Chase, what's the story? How do you make a living? You came out of nowhere, you made it this paid podcast, you got great guests on like almost immediately, plus me. What's the deal? Come on, tell me the real story. What do you do all day? Where do you do it? How is the CIA paying you? Is it Putin? Come on.
So I started. I signed up for Twitter in, I think it said April 2009. That would have been my junior year of high school, and I was inactive until.
You may as well have been 10 years old.
Yeah, right. I was inactive until the beginning of last year, at the beginning of 2021. And
you reserved your name and then
right,
forgot about it.
right. And so I basically got to the point, particularly after January 6th, where I was exceeding.
Okay. During that time, you were in
Yeah.
suspended animation, or you lived a life.
Yeah, I had a normal life.
What happened in this normal pre-podcast, pre-social media life that has enabled you to collect books and buy cameras and start a podcast with relatively high production values? Are you a petroleum heir? Are you a tobacco heir? What do you do? Do you work? Did you
Yeah,
work?
I'm in the fentanyl business. No, I own a small advertising business. I started in 2016. So I graduated from college in 2014. I worked for a company that owned 60 Sprint mobile stores where I learned how to do digital marketing. And then 2 years after that, I started taking clients in the evenings, and that's when I started my business. So I've been doing that full time since 2016, social media advertising.
And I do remember now that you did tell me that. In fact, so the point is that when you were ready to, when you decided to launch, and I love, and I'm going to ask you to repeat your origin story on the podcast because it's really inspiring and important. You knew exactly what to do. Kind of like,
yeah.
I mean, maybe not specifically on the podcast piece of it. I don't know how much of that was part of what you were doing in the past, but digital marketing was something you already understood.
That's right.
And Jeremy, my producer, will tell you that I was a pretty quick study myself because of, unlike you, I wasn't ignoring Twitter for, I mean, for years, I probably got what, I did very, very little with it because there wasn't really anything to do. The world wasn't coming to an end. And in those days, you could read a newspaper or listen to the news and actually get news. So you didn't have to rely on Twitter to find out what was actually happening in the world. So now we understand that you're a regular guy. You were working, you were having some success, obviously, because you were able to start your own business. You called a small advertising agency. Fine, I'm not going to push you on that, how big it really was, how small it really was, but it was enough for you to make a living. And when you decided that it was time for the one to be heard, you knew exactly how to make it happen. And but why? Tell us again. You never told us. You never told the ColemanNators. Tell the ColemanNators. Why did you do it?
Well, it's hard for me to pinpoint one exact reason, but it really came to me after sort of between the November election and January 6th, and then especially after January 6th, where I just felt exceedingly frustrated with the narrative, the corporate press, and feeling as if I didn't have a voice as an American.
I mean, that was an incredible period of time, wasn't it? When you think back on it, from election day, well, I mean, all the way to January 6th is, from election day basically through January was insane. It was the psychic pressure, if you care about these things, and watching the way things were unfolding was unbelievable.
The mass formation psychosis, which was explained away as mass formation psychosis.
Right.
The belief in mass formation psychosis is just mass formation psychosis.
Oh, I forgot about that. Very good. Yeah, that was very.
And so I decided to start this podcast and try to build my Twitter following, just because I want more influence, frankly.
You have something to say, and you knew that you knew that you had a way to make it heard. Isn't it so someone who is in marketing and advertising, we tend to think so much of those fields as very data driven and metrics driven. You have, I have some familiarity with the world of network advertising, and I'm familiar with just how commodified and there are formulas, there are algorithms to doing so much of this. But what you've done, notwithstanding, but having had this experience in the commercial influence field, you believed that one American can make a podcast, have conversations with people, have it heard, and make a difference. Would you have given I mean, was that despite your professional experience or because of your professional experience?
That's a good question, and I think it's to be determined whether or not I'll be able to actually make a difference.
Oh, so that was the next question: is in a
Sure.
year, and small change that since you started this, right? It was April of last year. You felt as if any kind of difference has been made? But I want to first go back to the snapshot of it's March 2019, and you're now starting to plan this together, not 2021, and you're starting to put this together. You say to yourself, what am I doing? I mean, there's no metric for this. There's no Q score. There's no, like, are people even listening anymore? I mean, okay, I have a square jaw and a full head of hair, so I know that helps, right? Or did you say to yourself, based on my experience, there is an audience for the right message. People do listen. They're not only manipulated. They're not only NPCs, being herded into, different off ramps. What was your thinking along those lines? I mean, it's a question that I assume I know the answer to by asking it, because why would you waste your time?
Sure.
If you were off Twitter for all those years and not doing anything, you're not the kind of egomaniac that I am, who smears himself all over the internet, like my wife says. So you obviously thought it really could make a difference.
I think so, but I think it was more than any sort of like altruistic, I'm going to make a difference type mentality.
You wanted to sell pillows.
Yeah, I want to sell pillows. I just felt compelled to do it. And it wasn't out of any sort of morality or philosophy. It's just that I've always been fascinated with politics ever since I read The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand when I was 17. And I've kept putting it off and putting it off and putting it off. And because there's no money in it. It's not a practical thing to, I'm going to be a social media influencer and that's how I'm going to feed my baby, right? It's not practical. And so I finally got to a point where I was frustrated enough.
First I'm hearing.
Right. I was frustrated enough and B, financially secure enough to just sort of take the risk. This podcast that I've done is something that I would do even if I didn't have any followers. Like having conversations with you is something that I would do even if there were 3 people listening, right? Or if I had 3 followers. Getting to meet Roger Stone, Gavin McInnes, these sorts of people has been really rewarding to me personally. So it's not so much about a goal that I'm trying to accomplish as much as it is about me doing something that I really enjoy and that really matters to me.
Well, I think you make an important point. I mean, you can't. Did you listen to podcasts? Do you listen to podcasts?
Yes.
So anyone who has ever listened to me, well, no, I don't say it all the time, but I don't. There are very few exceptions. I just don't have the patience to listen to other people talk, which is, it's really not because of intellectual arrogance. Believe me, I have plenty of intellectual arrogance, but I don't think that's the reason. I think the reason is I just don't have. I could have stopped at the word patience. I just don't have the patience. But sure. There are a couple. I will find myself listening to Michael Knowles from time to time because I just love the guy. And on YouTube, I listen to Liberal Hive Mind, who I never even heard of until someone told me that he mentioned a tweet of mine. And I like his, I like the what is it? Something of his jib, the fit of his jib, not the fit of his jib, the snip of his bib. There's some kind of jape of his wig. Anyway, I like the way he does it. I like it, it's in and out pretty, and snappy and snarky. But the fact is, doing it is fun. Doing it is a lot more fun than listening to it. And I think do you think it's possible at all? Like you talk about guys like Gavin and Roger Stone, whom I've never met or spoken to. Do you think that is any way that having a conversation with guys like that who are influential in their own ways, notwithstanding how much has been done to undercut their influence, is a kind of influence in and of itself, that they come away from the interview maybe thinking about a question you asked or thinking about some aspect of your conversation that maybe makes a difference in their way of seeing things, or do you think that's a little bit optimistic?
I'd be flattered to know to know that to be the case. I don't know whether
Well, think
or
of
not
yourself
Rogers,
as a podcaster. Let's forget that
Sure.
someone like Roger, who's even
Sure.
older than I am, right? And it's true, the older you get, the harder it is to make a dent in the rock. I get that. But surely you would agree, because I would certainly say that every conversation you have as a podcaster enriches you. I mean, like you've definitely always learned something. I've had several guests where I've gone in expecting conversation A and had conversation B and really got schooled. You would agree, right, that you're learning. It's not just a show. You're listening and you're learning yourself.
Absolutely. The people that I have on my podcast are in a different league than I am, for the most part. So every time I have a conversation with a guest, I walk away feeling like I got more than they did.
Well, that's pretty good, right? So if they're willing to come on, and you recognize that there's almost no way to break through to be the next Joe Rogan, it's not going to happen for the vast majority of us. Jeremy is always encouraging me, but a year I guess we started around the same time, actually. When did you start? April of last year?
I started in May 2021. I think you started a couple months later.
No, I think it was around the same time, actually.
It was? Okay, great.
Yeah, but I wasn't on video until I did my first Michael Knowles interview.
I see.
Because as I've mentioned a couple of times, actually, this happened with Jack Murphy too. He was on camera. He was in his studio, and he was recording because he was not going to let anyone, say he said something. Or no, he wants to have control over the media himself, which was cool. We weren't confident. I wasn't confident enough yet to go live, but with Michael, it was just there. It just seemed so perfect. Let's just start recording it. Let's see how it goes. And since then it's been, my love affair with the camera and that smiling bald face that I see, during these conversations has only blossomed. So you're growing. I mean, here's I guess the question all of us ask. Maybe you have an answer to it. Yeah, you're growing. Yeah, it's fun. Does it become something? What do you think it looks like in 2 or 3 years? Like when you've done, how many episodes are you now? You probably do a lot more than I do.
I think I've done 90. I'd have to look for sure. Somewhere around 90.
So I'm in the 70s. This will be something in the 70s. When it's 150, when it's 200, and the subscriptions have pretty much leveled out, right? Because you're not really doing anything more, and you're not going to get Donald Trump on, and you're not going to. You think you're going to still want to do it?
Yeah, because I haven't gotten sick of it yet, but I've gotten a little bit spoiled. When I started, I was happy to have anybody on. And now that I've had such great guests like yourself, no, that's not true. But now that I've had such great guests, I'm a little bit spoiled in terms of who I actually want to spend an hour with to talk to.
And that's tricky. That's true. And the fact is, so this is your opportunity, because you do have, even if your subscriptions aren't doubling every month, you have a base of people who are subscribing and downloading and listening. You have an opportunity. This is something I've always considered, I think a great opportunity on Twitter, as someone who, got into meaningful numbers a few years ago, to bring to people's attention people that they haven't necessarily heard of. And on the one hand, you want the sexy guest that you can pitch and do that fantastic thumbnail for, and that has all this SEO goodness to it. I mean, if I do something with Michael Malice, Mr. SEO, or Count Dankula, I know I'm going to get unearned views just because of who they are. On the other hand, if I bring on guys, I don't want to name any names, but a lot of my guests are much less well known,
me.
Well, but no, I don't think you're okay. Fair enough. You're not Count Dankula, but I'm even talking about people even, you do have 90,000 followers, 70,000.
70, about 75,000 on Twitter. Yeah.
So that's a great opportunity for you and for your listeners and for them. And often they're every bit as interesting as the well-known people. And also the well-known people often have a spiel that they're just ready to give. Not always. But I mean, there's one guy I'm thinking of in particular who it wasn't even an interview. He was on autopilot. He's a brilliant guy, super duper successful. He knows exactly what he wants to say to promote his book. You just really have to cue him or let him take a breath by asking something. And on the other hand, people who have to kind of you have to build up from the bottom up. That's more of a sort of, would you call this journalism? Whatever it is we're doing, podcastism challenge, hosting challenge, than someone who comes with all that equity, all that viewer equity as soon as they start out. On the other hand, here I am, the space that I occupy and live in, not just as a creator, but as a consumer with social media, is kind of a strange one. So like when I had Count Dankula on, and he was explaining to me how he became so famous, and I was not familiar with the story. Like everyone, he followed me, and we followed each other a while ago. I knew he was like a really well-known internet guy, and that he had been associated with, the alt-right or the alt-light or something, but I didn't know the story. I didn't know how he had gotten to be so, and I was so smitten with him. Oh, in fact, he's one of the guys I also listen to, his Mad Lads stuff. And the reason is that almost regardless of the subject, just listening to that Scottish accent is so worth the price of admission. So I agree with you. And it's a super fun thing to do. You do have to have a budget, hopefully eventually at some point it becomes. Now for me, on the other hand, I can also not only can I rationalize it, but I think it's a successful rationale. It has done wonders for my social media engagement in general. As you know, having content and having video content in particular does all kinds of things for you on other platforms as well. And as someone who is trying mightily to drive traffic to my law firm's website and to my own, law-related professional, the stuff where I actually make a living from, it's been fantastic. I've gotten really, it makes a difference for me to have 200,000 followers rather than even 130, which is what I was at. I was moving sideways in that band for a long time, as statistically unlikely as that might seem to you. You, on the other hand, you're not promoting your other business. There's no reference to it on the website, on the About Me. In fact, again, on the About Me, you don't even really know what else you do. I mean, it does kind of seem as if you want the Chase Geiser identity on the internet to be about the podcast. Yeah. That's it.
I'm doing it for the sake of it. That's exactly it. Yep. Yeah. And one of the most rewarding things that you mentioned a lot there. And one of the things that came to mind was one of the reasons that I like having less influential guests on who I find interesting is because I think it helps safeguard the authenticity of the podcast. So if I were to just have big names or just go after, the sort of A or B list sort of conservative influencers, I was concerned that I would lose the authenticity of the show. And I want to be able to, I make an effort to have conversations that I feel are interesting, regardless of the status of the guest. That's one thing. And the second thing, I don't know if you've had this experience, Ron, but I've actually made some great friends out of doing this podcast thing. Like Nikki Klein has become a close friend of mine. I talk to Matt Couch 3 or 4 times a week. And so the people that I've actually developed relationships with, it's been really sort of a life-changing experience in that sense. And I think for those reasons alone, that's enough to keep me doing this for, years to come, as long as I don't get deplatformed.
I think you won't. I think you understand
I follow the rules. Yeah.
Well, nobody knows what following the rules means, but you know what the unwritten rules are. And
right.
And sometimes I'll use a phrase and people, oh, Ron, they're going to kill you for that. I can't believe you just, no, I really know what I'm doing. I know, because first of all, even though Twitter doesn't necessarily love me, and I spent years being shadow banned, but I do think that there's a certain amount of respect that whoever it is who has my file knows that I'm using certain words in ways that should not be deemed offensive, and that other people might not get away with because they don't have the track record. But your point about making friends is so great. I mean, there are all these people who I followed for years, and Dankula is almost an extreme case. I don't know if he considers me a friend. Like I said, I fell in love with him, but guys who I knew a little bit, and we would maybe DM from time to time. But after a couple, like I've had Josh Hammer twice. We met in person once in between the two interviews, but you spend an hour, 45 minutes talking to someone literally face to face. It's every bit as much face to face as it is in meat space, except there's no bad breath, right? And I don't know if you're wearing pants, but besides that, it's pretty much, and in fact, you're forcing yourself to have a conversation with the other person in a way that's a lot harder to do at a reception or a cocktail party or some event. So yeah, I mean, he and I are, he and many other people like that I'm much closer and friendlier with now, and I've made completely new friends, people who I definitely would have never had any kind of relationship with before. So yeah, I mean, it's really, it is a form of social interaction that didn't exist until 10 years ago. But also it's a form of micro publishing that is enabling people to have conversations about what are often forbidden subjects, if they're macro. And historians will look back on this time, whether anyone's ever going to download all those podcasts and listen to them all, I don't know. I'm sure they'll listen to ours, of course. But,
first.
Right. It's an incredible phenomenon. And the more you get into it, the more you understand how cool it is and how, expanding it is for you as a person. And if as I have, you can get some professional benefit out of it, so much the better. Do you do about 2 episodes a week?
It depends. Sometimes I hit it really hard and I do one like every day for a month. And then sometimes I go a month without doing one. It's been a while since I've done my last one. I don't really have anybody solid booked next week, but I think that in August I'll start hitting it hard again. But I've been focusing on writing my book, so I actually have some words down.
When does the manuscript due?
Well, the manuscript is due 2 days ago.
I knew that the word "ago" was going to be in this answer. If we're going to be friends, it has to be that But what's fascinating? Okay, so you're a regular person, or at least you're someone who will come on and do this even though you're overdue. Try to book Michael Malice when he's working on something. No can do. I respect that so much. That's how you get things done, and that's how people apparently make money in the legal professions, is by really focusing. And podcasting. See, so Michael he's obviously a wildly successful podcaster, although I'm not sure that I would sell underwear, but then I don't think I could sell it as well as he could, because I don't necessarily bring to the table what he does in the underwear department. But he's able to do it and not get distracted by it. He compartmentalizes things appropriately. It is, it is a little bit of a challenge, but I think something is going to change. I mean, the fact that right now there's so much independence still available, that, in other words, guys such as yourself and I, and even people who are someone like Jack Posobiec, okay, so who's immense, and whose associations are much more explosive. We work with Roger, and he's grown a lot. Jack has. He podcasts, and you can get his podcast on all the major platforms. Podcasting is sort of this car. I mean, they tried to take down. Remember what they tried to do with Joe Rogan? The hippies they were going to take their music off.
Right.
What was it?
Neil Young.
No, but which was the
it was ivermectin. Oh, it was Spotify.
They took their music off Spotify. Hey, we're going to show you. That failed. That really failed. But even if it had not failed, I don't think it would have led to a cascade of similar pressure on people of less influence, which is everyone. I mean, Joe
Right.
is, just say Joe. I never met the guy, never spoke to the guy, but I mean, it's podcasting. I'm going to call him Mister. He's good.
Mr. Rogan, very talented, very influential.
Actually, there's one person when I speak to Robert George, I call him Professor George because he's a professor where I went to college, and he's also just such a respectable person. Just just not ready to call him Robert, and he hasn't invited me to either. I don't really understand why, given the ability, the technological capacity, such as for example, think of YouTube, how YouTube will take you down in a second and demonetize you at least.
Sure. Got a lot of problems with that.
You have already?
Yeah. Yeah.
But on the audio side, you probably have not had related problems, right? Same episode on Apple or Spotify, no problem.
Right.
They're not doing that. YouTube is. That's interesting. Tell me about your YouTube problems.
So I had the Roger Stone episode that I did was taken down once because he briefly mentioned election fraud. He didn't actually claim that the election was stolen. He just mentioned the argument. And then in
other words, that was their pretext.
Exactly. And then so what I did was I waited I think it's 60 days or 90 days for the strike to go away.
I just reposted it.
I reposted it, but I removed the comment he made. And then they took it down again, saying that he was it was COVID misinformation. so I think that they're just after him, and so I've had that issue where I've had strikes and I've had to wait 90 days before posting controversial stuff. And I'm very careful. I don't talk about COVID related stuff. I don't talk about election fraud related topics with my guests, just because it's, a pain in the ass to deal with YouTube. But the rules are so stringent that if you have any sort of a conservative bent, it's almost impossible not to break them, even when you're being careful.
Yeah, I had it. I did. I posted an interview by Josh Lekach. I don't know how we say it in English. Lekach. His podcast has a funny name, but it was about. I talked at length about election fraud because of my experiences in Philadelphia on the Trump legal team, and they took it. They took it down. They took it down.
Yeah.
YouTube took it down, and I mostly am interested in fighting these fights on behalf of my clients. It's not as if I had something to say in that interview that added any particular special value. You could find it on Rumble. You can find it elsewhere.
Sure.
It's not worth the aggravation, but it is so troubling to realize that there are adults running these companies, and they're so handcuffed, so bound to these to personalities and categories of discussion that they consider to be beyond the pale, that even in 2022, they're still clicking boxes as if nothing has been learned, as if all the secrets aren't out, as if we still believed in in vaccination.
Sure.
And cloth masks. This morning I saw, when I woke up, a tweet from someone who had been locked out, a doctor, or maybe that was yesterday. She'd been locked out because she retweeted an article from, here it is, Chris Held. I don't know if you saw that this morning. I'll get that screen up here. I got an email that my Twitter account is locked for sharing this Epoch Times piece. Okay. Violating potentially harmful information related to COVID-19. And this is, I guess I was better before. COVID, and this is just a headline from Epic Times. COVID vaccines increase menstrual irregularities 1,000-fold, fetal abnormalities 100-fold. Doctors Veers analysis. Twitter. I mean, obviously, and I think you alluded to this. Obviously, they don't really think that they're affecting the conversation on these topics anymore. They're focusing on certain people to make sure that they stay within narrowly drawn lanes.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things that come to mind with that. The first thing that comes to mind is, what outcome do they think that they are preventing? Right. Which is basically what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
Right. What outcome do they think that they're preventing by doing this censorship? And the second thing that comes to mind is, if you go back 10 years to 2012, there was virtually no censorship on social media except for, explicit racial slurs, perhaps, or something like that. And
not much. I mean,
everything was fine, though. It's like we had total freedom of speech on the internet before, and it's not like it resulted in any sort of catastrophe. So that leads me to believe that the only real function of the censorship is to silence a certain political persuasion. And I'm not saying that all conservatives don't believe in the vaccines or all conservatives think ivermectin's great. You can't really lump every person of a particular political persuasion into being on one side or the other of any given issue, just because people are complicated. But it seems to really be hyper focused on targeting conservative voices, and the only reason I can think of is because these left-leaning institutions really don't want Republicans to have any influence in our culture.
I think it's a little bit less narrowly. I mean, I think that that's included, but my thinking is that their thinking is that's a point of view. That's a discussion, an argument, an attack on our political power and the political power of those we trust and who work for us, that we're not going to allow to happen. Like, it's not, he's a Republican. It's
right.
These are points that are bad, that harm the oligopoly that is running the country now. Do you ever ask yourself, do they know they're the baddies? Have they turned the corner and realized that, yeah, this is what we're doing? Or do you think they're the rationalizing is strong enough that they really go to bed every night feeling that they're on the side of the angels?
I think an overwhelmingly small number of people actually think that they're a bad person.
Chase, I'm reminded of a conversation I had very recently with a good friend of mine who was telling me about how in the healthcare field, there are all these people who were universally acknowledged to be thought leaders, people who would, of course, be the one you'd want to have keynoting your conference. Once this COVID-19 Lysenkoism took place, they just went, either they went one way or the other. They either became authoritarian censors, or they were written off as lunatics and quacks and people who couldn't be trusted, people who are, in many respects, almost created some of these fields. It's I mean, if you ever, in fact, I think that leads to a good question. Is there anyone that you would be afraid to have on your podcast because they have been so, you had on Roger Stone. That was pretty daring. Did you learn from that maybe you can't have people who are that radioactive?
Yeah, I don't know. There's no one that I wouldn't have on if I was genuinely interested in speaking to them, just because that would be a compromise on my integrity that I wouldn't be comfortable with, to say no to somebody that I would love to talk to just because I'm worried about the ramifications on myself. But that being said, I do think there's, the Alex Joneses are hot, the Roger Stones are hot. But the thing that's really interesting to me about the censorship and the disregard of experts that don't go along with the narrative, right? Because they're always about trust the science, trust the experts. But then when experts disagree with the narrative, that's when the censorship comes in. It doesn't really seem to me that these big tech platforms like Twitter and YouTube are actually doing the censorship because they care about saving lives and genuinely believe in the narrative that they're pushing. And the reason that seems apparent to me is because you can advocate for war in Afghanistan or withdrawal in Afghanistan, no problem. That has way more implications in terms of lives lost, innocent people suffering, that type of issue, right? Than perhaps COVID, whether or not children should wear masks in school, right? Given the numbers that we know of children who died of COVID, it's like 1,100, I think, since the beginning of the pandemic, most of whom I think had like leukemia and stuff. So the point I'm trying to make is it seems to me that we were in a situation with this pandemic where there was a tremendous amount of pressure applied to the populace in that people didn't know if they were going to have their jobs. People were forced to be locked down. And I think the censorship was more an attempt to maintain order in society than it was necessarily an attempt to actually save lives. Because if you have all these people raging and disagreeing about the seriousness of a pandemic and whether or not a vaccine is safe or there's a safe treatment like ivermectin, then as the pressure gets more and more intense in terms of the economic pains and financial pains people are feeling, the lack of liberty that they're experiencing, I think that those controversial or those combating narratives could catalyze problems for leadership that they were trying to prevent. So ultimately, I think that this was like a psyop in the sense that they were really just trying to maintain order.
Well, I mean, I'll try to add another shading to that, which is,
Sure.
I think it's entirely plausible that both the governments, and social media companies really intended to do everything they could to be good citizens and to be conscientious. And then they realized, whoa, this works.
Yeah.
We can do anything with this. And being the kind of people they are, they did. I don't believe there's any evidence for the proposition, lab leak or not, loss of function, gain of function or not. There was lots of irresponsibility. There was lots of risky stuff going on, and I think Fauci is a human rights criminal. But I don't think there was a conspiracy to have a pandemic and then to use the power that resulted from it for evil. I think that there was a pandemic, there was panic, there was a power grab and a phenomenal lack of pushback. The judiciary rolled over, completely jettisoning constitutional rights under the rubric of emergencies, when emergencies are exactly, those are the pressure points at which constitutional rights are supposed to win, not lose.
Right.
Legislatures either permitted governors to assert emergency powers or granted them and then never came back to retrieve them for the democratic process. And the press and the social media companies fell right into line. Once you realize you can do that, but I think you make a good point. By so overplaying their hands, I think they have, and I wrote about this a while ago, they have turned so many people to levels of radicalism in their view of their relationship with the state, and with corporate America and with the media, that they'll never get those people, they'll never get us people back. They'll never get us back. And they've enabled us to identify and ascertain that there is a hardcore of 15, 20, 25% who are absolutely brain dead, who will go along with anything.
Yes.
Anything. And
they'll rat other people out who don't go along with it.
Yeah. And that's far more than you need to set up an authoritarian or totalitarian regime with full genocide. I said years ago, anyone who says never again is just saying slogans. God decides whether there will be tragedies of that scale. But the fact is, if something happens, it will happen. And there's those people. So, what did we learn? We've learned that a lot, they lost some, they gained some. Hopefully something happens in the midterms, which I think everyone believes will happen, that will have some kind of impact. Will it be a veto-proof majority? Probably not, but lots of stuff's going to happen. Chase, before we go, give us a heads up on the book. It has the same name as your podcast, which is keeping in your utter monomaniacal focus on one message, one America. Is it the book of the podcast? Is it your philosophy? Is it what is it? It's going to be.
Yeah, it's basically it's basically a political philosophy book. I would call it a policy book. The first half is more of like a political philosophy, and the second half is specific on each chapter is dedicated to a different political issue, be it education, healthcare, you name it. Sort of like a policy book.
Why don't I write a book?
You should write a book.
Yeah,
but I want to ask you something, Ron, before we get off, because when you mentioned genocide and you catalyzed this question in me. So, late 1920s Germany, unemployment was as high as 30%, and that set the foundation for Hitler to blame the Jews for everything. Everyone wanted to look for someone to blame for the state of desperation that Germany was in, right? So my question to you is, if the United States reaches a similar situation where 1 in 3 people are unemployed, there's hyperinflation, just hypothetically speaking, if we were to be in a similar socioeconomic status as Germany was in the late 1920s, who do you think America would blame this time? Who would be the victim of the next genocide?
It would not. It will be predominantly white males. It won't be genocide. What I said before, and I meant it, was that the mentality and the structure are there so that if people such as this were allowed to retain power and they thought it were necessary, genocide would be possible. But I often make this point: the difference between Weimar Germany and 22nd century America are vast. You could have massive unemployment, as we did during the Depression, and you could have the kind of stratification and polarization of groups that we didn't have until Obama in this country in the previous generation, which would make it look much like Germany in that respect. But what the Weimar Republic didn't have was a constitutional tradition, a democratic tradition, even really a rule of law tradition. The German state itself was a relatively recent concatenation of many nationalities, and to a large extent, the Nazis were able to play off rivalries within the principalities that worked to their advantage. There also hadn't been, everyone in Germany was suffering not only from severe economic dislocation, but from the moral nadir and the nadir of morale that had resulted from the loss of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, which was so poorly, thought out. So these are just some of the reasons why it won't happen here. What we have to worry about is, we have to make sure that here remains the here that we know. Some people ask, well, aren't we, when I say, is it going to be the same here? Things have happened in the last couple of years, and the January 6th Commission is a really rather scary manifestation of it, that we really didn't think could ever happen here. Things that are absolutely in the nature of totalitarianism. And the problem with them isn't just that they're happening, it's that there's so much among the elites again, that there's so much comfort with allowing them to happen and to have so much influence over the national debate. I mean, I don't think there's anyone listening to this who doesn't understand what's wrong with the January 6th committee. It is a show trial. The fact that no one's going to be executed as a direct result of a verdict in this proceeding doesn't make it any less of a show trial. The show trials in the Soviet Union had nothing to do with the determination of guilt or innocence. They were merely entertainment. They were propaganda, and the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, they were propaganda that was meant to influence public opinion so that the regime could do whatever it wanted. Those kinds of so someone asked me, someone whose opinion I respected quite a bit, is this kind of behavior going to result in pushback so that actually there's a radical right-wing response, which results in a dictatorship of the right, or maybe in turn of the left, because enough deplorables do something, get goaded into doing something stupid, which in the case of, if you're being a Trump supporter, means gathering on the street together and discussing politics. I don't think so. Well, first of all, the right-wing reaction, it simply isn't the way the American right operates. There is no radical radical right in the United States has no influence. They're mostly lunatics, in the cornfields. They're the favorite subject of the Anti-Defamation League and the SPLC and the Biden administration and Democrats in Congress, but they're a non-meaningful influence on policy and in and of themselves. But as boogeymen, they're everything. In fact, those are the Jews. Those are the Jews. But Republicans and conservatives are not prepared, I'm glad to say, and I know that there are people who think I shouldn't be glad to say, people like my friend Jesse Kelly comes on very strong on this. No, we need to be prepared to do whatever they would do to us. And I get beat up quite a bit for saying it is not a victory to become what you despise.
Right.
And it simply isn't in our blood. I'm not, if the reason I'm being a conservative, the reason I'm doing my podcast, the reason I take my shots, the reason I lost 2 positions in very well-paid partnerships isn't because I dream of a right-wing dictatorship. It's because I want to preserve the greatness of constitutional Republican, small r, freedom in America. And it is not a victory for me to, even if I couldn't, by the way, how you couldn't, because you'd never get the media on your side, academia, the grain of the culture wouldn't permit it. And I think that's fine, because we won't, I really believe, unlike those, and it's a heck of a way to end this, because these are where the comments are going to be on, to the extent that people comment at all on the podcast. I don't think it's going to go that way. I don't think it's going to go that way, but I do think that vigilance and the pushing back the way you're doing it and the way I'm doing it, and so many other friends of ours are doing it, is what we have to continue doing. And coming off the July 4th weekend, which is what we just did, people will be seeing this in a few weeks, but it was certainly interesting to see what has become of Independence Day in America. Hopefully we'll be back to one America someday, but I don't think it'll be the same one America that I remember, even if it's the one that you remember. Chase, fantastic. This is going to be a great episode.
I appreciate you for having me on. It was an honor and a pleasure to be here.